Welcome back to our Sunday night Bible study. Some things I need to start with in this lesson. If you will go back and watch last week's video, you don't even have to watch last week's video. If you'll just go back and read the comment section, Sister Rose Barnes gave me permission to touch my Bible. She said that I could touch my Bible, that I had her permission. So, if you see me touching my Bible a lot and it bothers you, you go see Sister Rose Barnes because she said it was okay for me to do that. Second thing that I need to say is everything went smoothly in my house of watching the video because I was quarantined to the bedroom so that I could watch in there and everybody else could watch up front so I wouldn't be such a distraction. And then Caleb came and knocked on the door and tried to open the door. And I was like, buddy, what are you doing? You're going to get me in trouble. But it all worked out fine. It all worked out fine. Thank you for participating in these studies. Thank you for the comments and the feedback that you give. As I said last week, I've had a lot of fun with these. Not only have I had a lot of fun, these studies have been good for me as a reminder, to serve as a reminder. And I pray that they have been a source of hope and encouragement for you during these trying times, to say the least. Last week, or last video, our last Bible class, we began a study on encouragement. And we said that if I want to be encouraged, and if I want to turn around and be an encouraging person, then I need to change the way that I think. And I want to build upon that and lay that foundation last week and build upon changing the way that we think in this lesson. I want us to pay attention to what Paul, it wasn't Peter, it was Paul. What Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy, I know what I'm supposed to say. I know that it's 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7. I'm making it hard on Debbie, who's going to be editing these videos. I'm sorry, Debbie. 2 Timothy 1 in verse 7. Notice what Paul tells Timothy. Paul told Timothy, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." What's the point? Paul understood that much of the dysfunctional behavior that he observed in society could be attributed to a lack of courage needed to face life's challenges effectively. Now, I've said this a few times, and I want to say it again here just for emphasis. Life rarely is easy. There are so many things in life to discourage us. There are so many things in life that can cause fear. And many times we don't do the things that we need to do. We don't do the things that we know we ought to do, many times out of fear. Maybe it's a fear that God's going to live up to His promise. That, all right, what if I go out on a limb of faith? What if I really trust God and I live according to His will? Is He really going to follow through? I don't know. And it is. It's scary to think about that. It's scary to take a leap of faith, so to speak, and truly to trust God. Intellectually, we know that we can believe and trust God, but just to acknowledge that intellectually is a lot different than living it. But the fact is, we fail to meet life's challenges so many times because of fear. And Paul is reminding us, he's reminding Timothy, he's telling Timothy, he's writing 1 and 2 Timothy, teaching Timothy how to be an effective evangelist. And he reminds him, hey, you can do it, and you're not to have a spirit of fear. Why? Because God is the one who provides the spiritual power that equips people to handle any difficulty that comes their way. Timothy needed to be reminded of that, and guess what? We need to be reminded of that. Now, before we go any further, it's important not to confuse courage with recklessness. Courage and recklessness are not the same thing. Courage is the inner capacity that enables a person to move ahead towards a meaningful goal and objective in life. It's not the absence of fear, but it's the stamina to continue on course despite potentially debilitating fears. I may feel that fear, but what courage does is help me to push through despite those fears. Reckless, though, being reckless is not seeking a higher good, but seeking a good high. There are a lot of things that I did when I was younger that someone as kids, we described it as courage. Looking back, it was recklessness, and there's probably other words that I could use to describe some of the things that we would do. One of those was being pulled behind a bicycle on a skateboard so that we can get enough steam to jump a ramp in the driveway. Well, what's the big deal with that? Well, it went right into the road, and we never once thought, hey, a car could be driving by and actually hit us. It was reckless and some other things. But that's just a taste. And now I'm having to live with the fear because I have a now 7-year-old daughter who has absolutely no fear. And now I realized why my parents, had heartburn all the time because of that. But there's a difference between courage and recklessness. The Bible is filled with examples of men and women whose faith and courage helped them overcome great obstacles in life. Great obstacles in life. And it's easy to look at examples such as Moses, and Moses going before Pharaoh. And we know that Moses was afraid because in Exodus 3 we have him there at the burning bush and him making those excuses. He didn't want to go. Fear was part of it. But then we tend to pretend or think that once the burning bush episode was over and he went before Pharaoh, that he was no longer afraid and that he never experienced fear the rest of his life. That's just not true. But notice what Moses told Joshua and the Israelites in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Moses was someone who did experience fear throughout his life. Look at all the things that he faced. Look at all the things that he had to endure. But what was the lesson that he took away with it? It's the lesson that he was leaving with Joshua and the Israelites. Be strong and courageous. Why? Do not fear. Why? Because the Lord your God goes with you. Moses knew that an awareness of God's abiding presence would kindle Joshua's courage, would kindle the Israelites' courage. And so when we find ourselves being overtaken with fear to the point that we're not acting, to the point that we're not facing life's challenges, what do I need to do? I need to remember that God is with me. That the same statement that Moses was able to say in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6 is still true today. And then we have somebody like Daniel. Daniel, a classic example of courage rooted in a right relationship with God. We talk about Daniel and the lion's den. Daniel, he was stoic. Daniel had absolutely zero fear when it came to the lion's den. No, he had courage. But that doesn't mean he didn't face fear. But he had courage to continue to pray the way that he had always prayed because of a right relationship with God, despite the fear that he may have felt. Or even in Daniel 1, when he refused to eat of the king's food because it would transgress the law of God. We think, well, that was an easy thing. He wasn't afraid when he did that. No, can't say that. Was he courageous? Absolutely. But how was he able to make such a bold stand despite fear he may have felt? A right relationship with God. Courage made Daniel a man of character and caused him to prosper. And here's the point that I want to make before we move into our lesson, into our main points, I should say, and that's this. Courage is what makes us people of character. If I want to be an encourager, if I want to build up other people, if I want to do right despite the pressures I face from this world, if I want to make sure that I'm not allowing fear to control me in uncertain times, then I need to make sure that I possess courage. That courage only comes from a right relationship with God. But with that courage comes character. As I said, courage is a divine resource needed by all Christians. And think about it. As Christian parents, it takes courage to raise your children according to the Word of God when we live in such a permissive world. We have so many passages we could look at with that. Matthew 22 and verse 37 about loving God more than anything. Ephesians 6 and verse 4, not provoking our children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It takes courage to put more emphasis on family than it does money. Not that there's anything wrong with money. Money's neither evil nor good. It's neutral. It's what we do with it. But the world tells us money is the end all be all. And how many families have been destroyed because the goal has not been to be the best family we can be, but money. It takes courage to stay at home and to put emphasis on family. I was having a conversation with a sweet lady a few years ago, and she said, I want to stay home with my kids, but everybody's telling me what a bad decision that is. She said, I want to be the one raising my kids. I want to be the one teaching them. And she said, I feel like that I'm receiving so much criticism from people that I thought would support me. And she says, I know it's the right thing, but it's hard. It takes courage to do that. In a world that looks down on things like that. Courage is a divine resource needed to face life's challenges. When it comes to developing courage, there are three things that I want us to talk about. We're going to talk about attitudes, we're going to talk about beliefs, and then we're going to talk about expectations. All three of those are how we develop courage in life. So let's start with attitude. There are two ways to handle life's difficulties. There's the easy way of shortcuts and compromises. And this is, maybe I tell a lie because in the moment it seems easier than to tell the truth, even though it complicates matters. I want to make things easier on me in the moment. And that's this way of shortcuts and compromises. When I take shortcuts and compromises, when I take the easy way out, rarely am I doing the right thing. And so that's the, if you want to say, coward's way, and that's strong language, but it's the opposite of the courageous way. The courageous way is of conviction and perseverance. It doesn't matter how bad things get. If I know something to be right, I'm going to do it. If I know something to be right, I'm going to stick to it despite what it costs me. And that's courage. And that doesn't mean an absence of fear, as we've talked about. We find ourselves in difficult situations sometimes, and we are fearful. We are afraid. But we still have to do what's right, and we have to stick to it. That's why a few weeks ago, we talked about the Christian grace of steadfastness or perseverance. But courage is what helps us to live with conviction and perseverance. You see, our attitude dramatically influences our performance. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. When I was growing up, I was playing Little League Baseball. And we were, I can't remember how old I was at the time. I think I was 11 or 12, but we were in Major League when it comes to Little League, what we called majors. And there was a kid, and his name was Aaron, and this kid seemed like he was 27 years old on the mound. I was a big kid, but Aaron stood a good foot taller than I was. And it seemed like when he was pitching that when he wound up and he let go of the ball about 2 feet before the plate because and it seemed like he threw so hard. And the first time I ever played him, I faced him 3 times. He struck me out 3 times. And my dad was one of my coaches at the time. And I came back to the dugout and after the last time, and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Okay." He said, "What are you thinking when you're in the batter's box?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking he's going to strike me out." My dad, pointed out, he said, you can't think that way. He says, if you get into the batter's box knowing that you're going to strike out, more than likely you're going to strike out. You need to get into the batter's box thinking that you can do it, thinking that you can be successful, essentially is what he was telling me. And he's right. Discouraged people are more likely to focus on perceptions of their personal limitations that are overblown. Negative attitudes inevitably steer a person on a self-defeating course. If I approach my Christian life this way, there's no way that I can please God. There's no way that I can make it. There's no way that I can be faithful. Then guess what? You are what you think. You are going to fail. But courageous people have confidence in their ability to cope with any circumstances. And in the darkest of situations, they see light at the end of the tunnel. Why? Because they know they're not without hope. And that hope, that confidence in their ability, it doesn't rest in themselves. Where does that confidence come from? This confidence of their ability, where does it come from? It comes from God. Look at Romans 8 and verse 18. Sufferings that we now endure are not worthy to be compared to the glories that shall be revealed to usward. Even in dark situations, Paul saw light at the end of the tunnel. Paul had confidence in his ability. Philippians 4, 11 through 13, he talks about in how every circumstance he's learned to be content. Why? Not because he thought he was good enough by himself, but verse 13, because I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. Our confidence and our ability to face the difficulties of life is rooted in our strength that comes from Jesus. Our attitude. Do I live my life defeated, discouraged, because I see my own limitations and I forget of the strength that is found in God? So my attitude plays a major role in the development of courage. Number 2, my beliefs play a major role in developing courage. Faith is courage enhancing. Think about it. What led to fear? In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus and some disciples are in a boat. A storm comes up and they find Jesus sleeping there in Matthew chapter 8. And they come running to Him and they say, "Don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care that we're about to die?" They're terrified. What caused that fear? It was little faith. It was little faith. In fact, that's what Jesus says in verse 26 of Matthew 8. He says, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" They let fear, they had some faith, they didn't have enough faith to dispel fear. But faith dispels fear and imparts courage. I love what the psalmist says in Psalm 56 and verse 3. He says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." Put my trust in you. I listened to a lesson just this morning, which this is a Monday morning. You're going to be watching this on Sunday. But I listened to a lesson this morning where the teacher was teaching on prayer. And he says, "Why don't we pray more?" And he says, this is something that we all struggle with, which I think is true. All of us can do better when it comes to our prayer life. I know that I can. And he says that one reason that we don't pray the way that we need to is we struggle when it comes to trusting God. We know that we should trust God. We know that we can trust God, but putting that into practice is something else. And prayer causes us to trust God. So when I'm afraid, I need to put my trust in Him. I need to ask Him to help me, and I truly need to trust that He's going to do that. I don't need to handcuff God. Faith operates by establishing a proper belief system. And what do I mean by that? This is what I mean. Courageous people expect adversity, but instead of seeing it as a negative, they perceive it as an opportunity to demonstrate faith and to grow spiritually. Notice what James writes in James chapter 1, verses 12 through 13. "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love Him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." Don't blame God for it. If I'm facing a temptation, don't say, "God, this is your fault. No, no, no. God doesn't tempt anybody. But I need to perceive it not as a negative, but as a positive. That's one thing I've been talking to our young people about. For the past few weeks, we've been doing a Zoom Bible study with our teens at 10 a.m. So at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, our teens log in on Zoom. We have a Bible study. I've been talking to them about the gift of temptation. Now, how many of us view temptation as a gift? Not many of us. And if we do view it as a gift, we don't view it as a good gift. And let's admit, we've all had gifts that we just loved, and then we had gifts that when we received them, we were like, we put on our best face, but we knew it was an awful, it wasn't a good gift. But how many of us view temptation as a gift? See, this is what we're talking about. Someone who's courageous, they look at temptation as a gift. They look at it as an opportunity to grow closer to God. They don't look at it and perceive it as unfair. Jesus in Matthew 4 was tempted. The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 4, He was tempted in all ways as we are, yet without sin, Hebrews 4 and verse 15. And Jesus used it as an opportunity to grow closer to His Father. Believers are sure that no problem is bigger than the ability to bear it. And that's, again, a promise, trusting in a promise that God has given us of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. And how can we trust God in that way? How can we trust God that He's going to limit temptation so that any temptation that I face is not bigger than my ability to bear it? Because Paul starts off by telling us that no temptation has overtaken you such as common to man. Then he says this, but God is faithful in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. You can have the right attitude. You can have faith in God and the ability to view temptation as a way to grow closer to God, a way to strengthen your faith, and to know that it's not too great because God is faithful. See, when we look at our attitudes, when we look at our beliefs, how can we have courage in those things? Both of those things are rooted in God. They're rooted in God, and that's exactly what Paul was telling Timothy in the introduction to our lesson. Finally, number 3, we have to have the right expectations. We have to have the right expectations. Anticipation is the third ingredient necessary for courageous living. And what do I mean by expectations or anticipations? It's this: I've got to know that these difficulties in life, I've got to know that temptations in life, they're going to come. They're going to come so I can be ready for them. I'm not caught off guard. Caleb and I sometimes we wrestle around, and I used to do it with my dad, and I really enjoy doing that with Caleb. We play fight and things like that. And every now and then he'll punch me in the stomach, and if I know that it's coming, I can tense up and it doesn't hurt. But I'll be honest, there are a few times where he's caught me where I wasn't anticipating it, where I wasn't expecting it, and I got that little fist right in the stomach, and I tried to play it off like it didn't hurt, and I look at him like, that's all you got? And then I turn around and I'm like, oh. If we expect it, then we can be prepared. And if I can expect it, if I have the right anticipation or the right expectations, then it provides a fearlessness to carry on in the face of great difficulties because of confidence in the final outcome. If I know that it's going to happen, then I can say, I know how it's going to end. What do I mean by that? Paul looked at his current circumstance in Romans 8, and he says in verse 18, as we said earlier, that the sufferings that we now endure, they're not worthy to be compared. Paul expected difficulties. But because he expected difficulties, he was prepared for it. And because he was prepared for it, he was able to look and say, you know what? It's going to be okay. And then just a few verses later, in verse 28 of Romans 8, he says, all things work together for good to those that love the Lord and that are called according to His purpose. You see the fearlessness in Paul. Because he wasn't caught off guard. He knew it was coming. Encouragers are convinced there is more to be gained by endurance than instability, and by bravery than cowardice. You know, Jesus said in Matthew 16 and verse 25, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." I've got to anticipate that difficulties are going to come. I have to prepare for them, but part of preparing is knowing that if I stay faithful to God, there's going to be the great outcome, that eventually God's going to right all wrongs. However, anticipating failure sets in motion a negative change of events from which it is very difficult to recover. Courage alone, and that's what we're talking about, is developing courage. And it's the right courage, or courage I should say, is rooted in the right relationship with God. And I hope that these things that we've talked about, our attitudes, our beliefs, our expectations, all of these have to be rooted in God. They all come from God. Courage alone, though, is insufficient. It's merely a quality that undergirds one's values. The fact is, I can have courage and be wrong. I can have convictions and my convictions be wrong. What's the point? When biblical truths are understood and accepted, courage will support them in action. You look at Daniel, you look at Paul, you look at Peter. The best example of this is Jesus. Jesus knew what the will of God was, and He displayed great courage in following that will. So let's have that courage. Let's have courage that is rooted in a right relationship with God. And courage that is rooted in a right relationship with God is understanding, biblical truths that we've talked about in this lesson. I go back to what Jesus said in Matthew 7, and He talks about, if you hear these words of mine and you do them, you're like the wise man who built his house on a rock. That's what I'm getting at. We have to make sure that our foundation is solid. And the only way that our foundation is solid, if it's built upon the words of Jesus. And if my foundation is built upon the foundation of Jesus, the words of Jesus, then my courage is rooted in the right relationship with God. And I can face the difficulties that life throws at me despite the fear that I may feel. Bow with me, please. God, thank You so much for loving us. Thank You so much for the ability to turn to You and to know that You are a loving God, that You are a merciful God, to know that You are there to help us, to know that You are more than willing to provide strength for us to endure temptation, for us to overcome any difficulty that life brings. And many times when we lack this courage, when we lack this faith, it's as You told us in the book of James, we have not because we ask not. Help us to turn to You. Help us to overcome our little fear, or our little faith, I should say, and to develop a great faith, not based upon our own abilities, but our abilities that we understand come from You. Our strength comes from You. We love You. We're so thankful for You, and we ask all of this in Your Son's name. Amen. Thank you for being with us. I look forward to being with you next week.